So I guess one of the first questions we have today was if actually is it possible to celebrate who I am as in my identity while appreciating at the same time the differences or other identities. And I think because we have been gathering these questions, but we don't have an answer. I think there is no right or wrong in these questions, so it's just open for reflection. So if anyone around the table had something they would want to contribute, or your thoughts, would it be possible to celebrate who we are? When speaking about sectarianism, we're speaking of sects or two sects of the same religion or different backgrounds, different traditions. So celebrate that while still appreciating or caring about the other part.
I think it's important to make the distinction between cultures and political ideas as well as religious ideas. I think the three are quite different, but they do get conflated and they do get confused together.
Mm-hmm.
So this idea of celebrating yourself, does that affect someone else? I think culturally it never really does. I think that maybe it's when politics comes into it that maybe you have a problem that because you can only have one solution. For example, Northern Ireland's either British or it's Irish. There's only one solution, sort of thing. And so when politics comes into it, speaking specifically about sectarianism in Glasgow, then that can be an issue. Or maybe if religion comes in, because religion tends to be prescriptive as opposed to cultures which are not prescriptive, then you can have then there has to be an either or generally. But culturally, for example, we often hear about multiculturalism being a problem. It never is a problem. There's never a problem with different cultures.
Mm-hmm.
Problems arise when really you have beliefs about, for example, same-sex marriage, which come from religions or from politics. And that's where problems arise. It's never from culture. So I just think it's a good place to start to at least define what we mean by these different terms. And certainly I would say that as far as cultures are concerned, I lose nothing from your culture, you lose nothing from mine. But maybe religions that's where things get complicated, or politics is where it gets complicated.
Can I slightly disagree with that? I think that different cultures have exactly the same problems, actually, and can do, and I think that's sadly kind of coming to the fore right at the moment in a kind of sectarian way between Christians and Muslims, for instance. But when I think back, kind of thinking about some of the things that are in the Old Testament, which Christians look to as part of our tradition, there's actually a lot of rules, if you like, which I think are based from the culture of that time and those in that area. And some of those are still coming out within the cultures of that part of the world today. So I think there's a kind of mishmash, if you like, of religion and cultures. And I agree, politics doesn't help.
I suppose when I was thinking about this, I was thinking, well, what do we mean now by identity? And on the one hand, there's sort of traditional, inverted commas, identities around religion, race, gender, perhaps some of the things that are so historical they have to change or kind of in some way innate to how you are, but then there's a huge number of other identities that people pick up along the way, and some of them are kind of, as I was trying to think through them, we have sort of different forms of spirituality, but we also have identities around consumption, sort of materiality and all these sorts of things, and how we attach ourselves to all these different ideas, places, people, beliefs, political ideologies, things, and particular behaviours. And I think that on the face of it, to go back to the question, so would I lose something if you express your identity? I think that when you look at, say, some of the aspects around sectarianism in particular, I think it's nice to be, I'm inclined to kind of want to think that we can fundamentally all identities and all identities can somehow coexist, but I think there's some identities going both ways, that they actually can't actually be reconciled, and for all sorts of different reasons, and both on the kind of, I think march and parade would be a good example, because they are problematic, but on the one hand they're problematic in both ways, where some people would see those absolutely always as an affront to their identity, because they see part of their identity is seeing that thing as absolutely hostile to them, and it's whether or not that's an appropriate attitude to that, or is there a larger principle around, say, freedom of expression, even if we don't like what's being expressed. So I think these things are extremely difficult, and you have to look at all these other types of, even, you know, all these other sort of the ways in which identity has been configured now, and I think it makes it a very difficult question.
I think it depends on the nature of the expression of that identity and what it is that's being expressed. So if it's sectarian songs and banners, what is it that you're doing? How does that impact other people, and is that at the expense of other identities? Are you expressing your hate of other identities by flying those banners and singing those songs? I think within Catholicism and Protestantism, it's so complicated because it goes back for so long. You know, you can go back to the Huguenots and the ostracisation of Protestants from France, and Protestants still talk about that now as one of the core reasons that they feel the way they do about the Catholic Church. But then also we can look at Ireland and when the Protestants put everyone off the land and the potato famine and took over communities and took land away from Irish Catholics, forcing them to seek refuge in Scotland, where the dominant identity was Protestantism, so they were not treated well within that. They had power, so when a parade marches, when a banner is flown by the Orange Order, there's an ownership of public space around that banner and that march that is offensive to Catholics. But at the same time, Protestants are doing that, whether they're aware of it or not, with a historical background of being ostracised from somewhere else. But how far back can we go? How many religious wars do we have to justify what is happening in the 21st century?
I think one of the problems there as well is putting identity, I think that you touched on it, in silos. It's like, I am this or I am that, I'm a Catholic, I'm a Protestant, because nobody is just one of those things. And the homogenisation of that, like we're seeing with Islam at the moment, is one of the biggest problems, because you cannot put one person in one box and then, you know, which identity are you expressing? So like you said, like, is it through hatred, or is it a positive expression of who I am, or is it against someone else? And at what point is the most, you know, which is the most important? And then it comes down to values. It's a kind of dynamic thing. Absolutely.
For me, it lies into intention of the expression and the interpretation.
Exactly.
Of the expression. It's that thing when you write something down in one way, someone's going to interpret it in a different way, and the way to overcome that is, from my point of view, through conversation and talking, and it will, at the end of the day, comes down to respect and respecting each other's identity, respecting each other's religion and points of view, and so on and so forth. But how we get to that point is a big mire of misunderstanding.
And it's beyond tolerance. I think that we
absolutely.
use the word tolerance a lot, but tolerance isn't enough. You know, like if you look at the history of the LGBT movement, that has all been about working to. We don't just want to be tolerated. We actually want acceptance. So I think we talk a lot about tolerance, but it's just not enough. It's accepting that people are different from you, different opinions, but then it's about how it's expressed.
I think tolerance can also be seen as quite offensive in a way, because it suggests that I'm going to tolerate you because you're beneath me. That
there is something wrong. You're so offensive to me.
But I can deal with it.
I can do it. I can take a deep breath and just get on.
Absolutely.
It seems like, you know, the idea of tolerance, you know, I wonder if there's other ideas or other like frameworks you can think about, maybe the ideas perhaps about, say, hospitality, the sort of liberal principles perhaps, I don't know, that you maybe, it's trying to find a framework as a way to think about those interactions, and then I suppose as well that line between respect and disagreement, because I suppose that sometimes being offended. I'm always really interested in being offended by someone. I think someone said you should be offended at least once a day and twice on a Sunday or something like that. So, but where's the line? Where are you allowed to offend people, and are people not allowed to be offended? And so where's the kind of, because of the sort of society, sort of liberal societies we live in, there's space for that disagreement, and it can be quite strong disagreement. And then where's the line with the point you cannot disagree about things anymore? Is it just we all sort of agree that you can no longer disagree with this issue, and it's offensive to disagree with this issue? And I guess these things can run, they can have a bit of a duration, and it seems common sense now what we think is you cannot disagree with that point now, and for very, very good reason. But it's just where does that? How far do you take that with certain issues?
Part of the problem that we have, I think, is in the Human Rights Act. And I don't mean from a David Cameron point of view. I mean just as a document which has all these articles and then has all these clauses. So it will say in one article, it will say we have freedom of expression, and that's great. We all go away and have freedom of expression. But then it says in the clauses, unless you cause offence, unless it's not conducive to a cohesive society and so on, but it doesn't actually spell out exactly what it means by that. So basically both sides of the debate say, well, I have a right to say this, but then the other side say, yeah, but you cause me offence, but there's no actual adjudicator.
Yeah.
The Human Rights Act doesn't adjudicate on specific cases, so it's left to whoever does that, and they're generally not the usual politicians or people like that. So we're unclear.
I think
Exactly.
I think, as you said, the end is right. It would be politicians, and that's whose view ends up being the overarching. Yeah.
So they don't want to alienate voters, and it all becomes complicated. Yeah, exactly. There's no definitive guide.
And power.
Could I just kind of, another thought that strikes me is the connections between identity and story and tradition and traditionalism. And I think, and that kind of sense of I am who I am, and it goes a way back, and I cannot possibly change that. There's a lovely wee quote here that I found: tradition is a story learned from the past, told in the present, looking to the future, by Gary West from Edinburgh University, just given there. But something like that it's a moving thing, and that our identities are actually a living, organic, moving thing. But there's that sense that this is fixed, and that's a huge problem.
The first thing I thought of, randomly when I thought of this in a personal context, was my family and growing up between two different traditions, the British tradition and the Irish tradition, and the German tradition, and it all comes together at Christmas randomly, where we open presents on Christmas Eve, but we still get our stockings on Christmas Day. We never went to midnight mass or anything like that, but there was this sense of everyone coming together and to meet my family, and Christmas ends up being, rather than just people something for Christmas Day, it goes from Christmas Eve to Boxing Day and beyond, because we brought all the traditions together into one place and respected every member of our family. And when I now go to my husband's Christmas, I feel very odd because I don't really do anything on Christmas Eve, but I'm going, okay, this is with his family, so I'm going to go and do that. When we celebrate Christmas ourselves, we'll go back to doing Christmas Eve, Christmas Day. I think that it's about mixing the two together and bringing it all together and moving and changing it and making your own traditions.
That's where cultures aren't an issue. If you have a cultural thing to open gifts on Christmas Eve, or if the culture is still on Christmas morning, the two don't really contradict. Nobody's really getting upset about it. But the problem is, of course, when you have a political thing or a religious thing where there has to be a solution, and somebody's going to be unhappy about it. And that's where it is difficult to.
I guess coming back to the religious aspect, I think cultures interpret religions very differently often. And again, I can think of Islam as the most obvious example right now in terms of wearing the burqa or not, or is that then in law? And I think it comes down to the values and norms of that culture and tradition. So I feel like you can't pull them apart at all, really.
I think it's
we have
just
to analyse them though. We have to analyse
exactly.
what is that tradition. And I think that what Caro's saying about it being a moving thing and a thing that you look to the future is really the key thing, because things like, it's tradition FGM is tradition, female genital mutilation. Children being married at 8 or 9 years old is a tradition, but it's so damaging. We know the damage that those things cause in the 21st century, because we now have the research that those traditions need to now move on, and and things like the burqa, we need to unpick the traditions. What is that? I mean, the tradition of that is women being closed off from public society. And going back way before Islam, the burqa predates Islam, so it's come from somewhere totally different, where it was just about removing women from public life and keeping them inside. So we need to talk about that.
And then,
I suppose just on, I always thought that it's a cultural relativism thing where people say, well, we can do that because that's our culture, that's what I mean, that's our identity. I always thought it was a bit poor argument for anything really, just because it's IB, so IB.
Exactly.
I think you're right, it does need to be.
So perhaps part of what we need to be doing is actually looking at our own culture. Over the last 100, 200 years, whatever, however long we want to do it, and actually say it, so work out, well look, actually, we have moved, it is possible. And see actually the changes that we have made, because we have made those changes.
And I guess
think in terms of, just to keep on that point, I think the tradition of marching in our communities, and obviously loyalists are really like, this is what we do, it's what we've done for hundreds of years, this is our tradition, is that it's when that becomes, when society starts to say we don't want to see it anymore, that is an uncomfortable symbolic act for us that doesn't fit with contemporary values of equality. That now they've shifted the goalposts to say, well, actually we're an ethnic minority and this is our cultural expression. So what happens when that happens? Because and they're now saying, well, you're attacking us and we're a minority now.
That's the thing, there is no adjudicator. Like I was saying, they have a freedom of expression to manifest their beliefs, but also there is this thing about cohesive communities and so on. So both sides have their cases made for them. There is no adjudicator, and it comes down to politicians who tend not to want to alienate the voters. So,
and I think just maybe to add something, which is just my thought is like, because I think when I think about my identity, like being Spanish, then having lived abroad or working different languages, living in different cultures, for me, I think my identity is very linked to the socialization process. So that changes, of course. So for me, like there is a clear relationship there. Identities change, but that brings me to another of the questions that I'm just going to say to keep the discussion going. One of the questions we had from some of the trainings done with practitioners was whether it was more useful to focus the work with in young people or to keep working with adults. And the question was coming from the idea that as adults we are much more stuck or set in our ways of being, ways of traditions. We are speaking here traditions, stories, so is it much more difficult to change our point of view or just consider other point of view? I think the question is like, okay, I see like identities as something flexible, something that flows and changes, but I think also at the same time as when we grow older, when we grow as adults, it seems more difficult to be open to new things. So it's like, do we still have the willingness to be open to change?
For that reason, adults need more support.
Yeah.
I think that with all of the public education campaigns that are in place in schools, you've got young people. We've been going out and delivering this work for 3-4 years now, so we know that people, when we go into workshops, people are saying it's less than it was. After this wave of work, I'm sure it's even less than it was because we've talked to so many children and young people, and there will be a generational shift. But speaking to adults who are in contact with those children when they come home from school, or when they interact with them in their communities. We need those adults to be supported to change what might be problematic attitudes, and absolutely they have the ability to do that, I think.
I found that a lot of people seem to believe in the phrase, you can't teach an old dog new tricks.
I just
A lot
don't
of
think
people
that's
seem to
true.
be fixed on that, and I
Yeah.
don't agree with it at all.
It's like, I mean, we can teach. I'm thinking of my own parents who are in their 70s, who used to call the people that owned the shop on the corner something really not very nice and blatantly racist, but over time saying to my mum, you don't say that, you can't say that, Now she doesn't say it. Like, people can change it.
Although, is the attitude different though? I mean, people maybe the language has changed.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, is there a real change? That's
And
what we
was it
need to
coming
try.
from racism?
And that may well
Well,
be.
no,
Exactly, it was
comes
just,
from an ignorance,
yeah.
just maybe the language
Yeah.
around her.
Ignorance
was
is the
not
key.
that until-
Yeah.
Generally, I think.
Yeah,
I mean, the more people understand each other,
Yeah.
the better off we'll be.
Yeah.
I agree with you definitely about the adults, and even in schools, because we've had over the last couple of weeks, we've been delivering in schools for the last 3-4 years as well, and I've had about 3 or 4 teachers actually phoning and asking us to come in and deliver one-off, whether it's anti-racism or sectarianism work, because they're not sure what the best approach is to deal with an isolated case. And I think that's really scary for teachers, because they've got so much to deal with, and this one situation happens and they're not equipped to deal with it.
I was doing a sort of CPD type session with student teachers, and I kept getting asked the question, but if this happens and this one child says this, what do I do about it? And it's not knowing what to do in a very specific situation where actually you wouldn't do anything any differently if it was racism, if it was homophobic. You wouldn't treat it any differently. You would say that's not okay. But one of the other questions I was asked was, so I'm talking to people about this and so on and so on, but then their parents disagree, their parents come in and aren't happy about talking about this with their children, or they'll come back, but my mummy says, and it's that attitude. So it's actually, yes, it might be easier to talk to young people and children about it, but it is, I think, almost more important to be talking to
But at least you are setting up a contrary narrative. You are setting up a different narrative, which a lot of people don't get. They tend to get the one narrative from their parents. The very, perhaps even the most you can do is just that, but perhaps that'll be enough.
And I don't even think it has to be, doing work with adults that is about directly challenging. I think there's something about just exploring people's stories with them and their own motivations and how they've got to those opinions, so that they can have a real conversation with their children. When those kids come home and say, what's happened against Catholics is really awful, and the father or mother says, no, well actually I couldn't get a job because they asked me what school I was from and I was Protestant, and this is our story and our family. It just contextualises an experience rather than it just being black and white for children, because our personal stories are so much.
It's almost like, do you remember in South Africa they had the Truth and Reconciliation Committee? In a way we need to have that here and say, look, this is the kind of thing that went on. We're not happy about it now, but in the present day, have some kind of, so people can tell their story, as you're saying, but then we come to some sort of arrangement. Well, now we won't tolerate this kind of, prejudice against people and people not getting allowed to work for certain factories.
I think as well, there is there's this community education side of it where it is like about exploring the issue, just talking about it and thinking about it and looking at the history of it, and then there's that, and I think something there's a bit of a rush to say, well, that kind of like, well, we just don't say that anymore, we might think it but we don't say it, but that, especially as older people, if the message gets out that I might have these attitudes, but I can't say them, and I'm not going to say them in front of the kids because I know I can't. So the environment for those sorts of attitudes disappears, even though the people themselves have told them, they just know that it's not acceptable, and that starts to break the cycle. And I think that there is, on the one hand, there's the kind of there's the kind of the work with adults and deliberately on the topic, and then there's this kind of wider community education thing. I think it'd be a real shame if the work with adults slides away. I think it becomes a package really.
We need to equip adults to be able to have those conversations with young people as well, regardless of whether they're parents, grandparents, uncles, aunts.
I think you hit the nail on the head. I think it needs to be as well a wider sort of structural transparency of this is we acknowledge and we
so
will
also
deal
they need
with
therapy
it.
as a Western Scotland or a
Absolutely.
country.
But
We need
also
some kind of therapy and talking.
Yeah, but it also needs to be embedded in policies, I think, because,
Yeah.
you know, like you're saying in schools, it's like it's all very well for a teacher to know I have to deal with this and this is where I go to, but if it's not in their sort of overall arching structure, you know, they should have a framework and a support network of this is how we deal with things and this is our stance on it, which is missing, I think.
We've talked about, Liam, I think you mentioned ignorance, and that's obviously a part of it. But I think fear is something that is huge for people. I mean, for all of us, we all fear. And I suppose it's partly making ourselves vulnerable to another person because we're not sure how they're. We've talked before about how sectarianism is expressed and for what, you know, what if someone is doing it deliberately against us or simply saying this is who I am. And I think fear is a huge challenge for us all on all sorts of issues. But I think it would be really helpful to recognise that and try and. It's also about putting yourself where the other person is too and trying to understand where they're coming from. And that's, you know, that's a big ask for a lot of people. But I think it does help to try and begin to understand.
Ignorance breeds fear. I think where you have ignorance, you're going to have that vacuum and it breeds fear because it's the unknown.
Yeah, I think there's different techniques for doing that. I think that you go on, Julia, in your other questions to talk about the techniques, but just one of the things that we did was to produce, was to run creative writing classes for women, and they wrote their stories, and there's a range of experiences within there from childhood into old age, and a mixture of, you know, Catholic experiences, Protestant experiences, and people that are rejecting their culture, people that are still in that culture, and the stories really allow, we then use those stories to go out into communities and we analyse them and unpick them and ask questions, but they're a really good way to look at lots of different opinions and there's no conflict involved in that, you know, it can create subtle mind shifts just from without an argument, without a face-to-face confrontation, and just hopefully some kind of attitudinal shift and empathy, because the stories are quite emotional. A lot of them talk about violence that was experienced as children for certain uniforms, or ownership of daughters and sisters, and with brothers and fathers that are kind of pushing women into and upholding certain attitudes because it's the family and there's loyalty for the history in a family. So I think the methods that we use can be really interesting and creative, and it doesn't have to be head-to-head type thing, because that's scary.
I think because, I think sometimes when we say, oh, we are going to do a session to tackle sectarianism, I think the first thought in participants may be, oh, don't do this, don't do that, that kind of, that's kind of directive. And when thinking about it, for me, it's more about appreciate this, appreciate that. It's not like you were saying before, like one or the other, or either or. I think it's like how to bring those both and having a space to, share, like that safe space to share.
It comes back to your point as well about the words that we're not allowed to use, or this isn't okay, or we shouldn't do that. I think my worry about that approach is that people then just harbour those internally and express them in different ways.
That's always a danger.
Is that really going to blanket say?
It's why they would feel the need to say those words is the key.
Exactly.
It's always about why. Why do you feel this way? Why do you think this way?
Because like you said about your mother, you probably, in that situation, saying we don't say this and this is why, it's like, okay, well that's not my belief, so I won't say it.
Yeah.
But in other situations, what does it lead on to?
It's an interesting bit of the whole thing around language and in entirety, it's really interesting. And it's this thing about when you're doing, we're not quite on techniques yet, but when you're doing a session with people, adults, whoever, and having a session that's quite open and going, I'm not going to judge you for saying these words right now. I did an exercise in sectarianism, which is a sort of old hat one, recently, and I could see them going, that is a word. Don't worry about it. It's like they're just making that sure that you can redress it, and so this is what these words are. And
which is why sometimes it's easier working with young people because they don't have those inhibitions, so they'll just say it, and then you don't react by going, oh my god, don't say that. Okay, so where did that come from?
Yeah, and that is something that we have to be aware of, and when we go into workshops, that sometimes people's first instinct is to, when they see you, they read you and change their behaviour to match that, and want to kind of say the right thing, whereas you're going in and saying, say anything, just get it all out on the table, and then we can at least be truthful about how to unpick this, and I think then people feel really listened to when they're allowed to say the difficult stuff and the stuff that is like makes them angry or.
So they feel validated then.
Yeah, exactly.
So they're much more likely to listen to other people.
Yeah.
So,
like the idea of therapy you were saying before.
That's
I mean, you will listen if you've been listened to.
Yeah.
But and I think for me that brings me to another question, I guess, because I think it's like when speaking about the motivation to tackle sectarianism, like what are the motivation behind all this tackling sectarianism program, as in what do we want communities to take out of that? Why? What is the benefit? Sorry, I think that's my question. Is like the third last one. How is that going to benefit everyone? And I think this question comes from my own, just like reflecting on my own work. In our previous project, all our project outcomes were phrased language-wise in a very negative way, like tackling, challenging, diminish, reduce, like. And I think, well, myself personally as Julia, I wouldn't want to get involved in that. It's like that's not something that for me personally would be appealing, as in I already hear that in other places. So and it's like, okay, so what kind of difference is this going to make for the people we are working with? And I'm speaking about tackling sectarianism. I think that's also like the wider question. What kind of difference does the work we are doing make for individuals, if that makes sense, if that's
I think what it's doing is like what positive about is opening up conversations, opening up people to be whatever using the word, but open talking about these issues, whether it's sectarianism, whether it's another issue with their community, but opening it up and actually starting to recognise that there are issues and maybe we need to do something about it. I think that's where a lot of this work is going. It might not solve the problems, I think we're not going to get rid of sectarianism straight away. I think it's a long journey and a long journey. And I think what the work is doing is almost starting that. And then you can use them as all the projects we're using across different issues, tailoring it to communities. And that's the great thing I think that's come out of it is that for the first time communities and people who live in these communities have been heard and have been listened to. It's not something that's necessarily been immediately forced on them. Going, you have this issue, this is how we're going to deal with it. And it's like, do you have this issue? What does it look like to you? What do you think would be the ways for it to be dealt with or to change with you? That's my impression of what's going on, and I think that's what we can take forward maybe for other issues, for other things that are going on in communities, having a conversation with them and doing it from a grassroots level.
I think as well, if you look at this lot of funding and you look at as well the Offensive Behaviour Act, I think that to me, the more you look at the Offensive Behaviour Act, the more it looks more like a message sending activity, at least as much as it is a legal instrument. And I think that someone it's not my point, someone else said, well, the thing with the Scottish Government is they've got quite a clear idea about how they want Scotland to be, and they've got quite a clear idea about what a modern Scotland looks like. And it's a different idea, I think, to say what the New Labour version of modern Britain, but modern Scotland as well. I think they've got a slightly different idea about what modern Scotland is, what the cultures should be, and how we're all going to live together. But what the government doesn't have is it doesn't have the big fiscal levers, it doesn't have the big state levers that I'd like to say that the Westminster government does. So what it's really interested in is sending these sorts of messages about what modern Scotland's going to be, and how we're going to live, and how we should relate to each other, and what sort of conduct is going to be acceptable in Scotland. And I think that's been part of it. And to me, it's a fairly, from my point of view anyway, it's a fairly positive idea about how we should all live together. And I think it's been very, I think you're right, it has been very open. It's been about opening up and having these discussions, and I suppose, from a political point of view, these are not useful. The sectarian division is just not useful. It doesn't do anything. It's not productive. Nobody gains out of it. Ultimately, people lose out of it, and it doesn't really do anyone any favours, I don't think. So I think it's a message that it's no longer a useful type of division. Not that those identities, there might be good bits within them, but when they start to clash, when you have these more unfortunate sort of effects.
And it's surely connected to with empowering local people and communities. And just to kind of grab the Glasgow motto to let people flourish and communities flourish. And that's, for me, that's the kind of the end point. Except there isn't an end point because we're on a journey.
I think that this work came out of the household attitude surveys and people saying that sectarianism was alive and well in Scotland, and that there was a perceived threat around that. So I think that we've looked at what that threat was, and we've had loads of discussions with people around their attitudes to sectarianism, and I think that because this programme has been such a public display of sectarianism won't be tolerated and we're putting £9 million into stopping it, there's been a kind of a shift in attitude, but within communities. But I think it's also shut down certain organisations who feel attacked by that. I think that the Offensive Behaviour Act, it only really applies within that football context, and the SFA just aren't engaging in conversations about sectarianism, and I think that they just don't deal with sectarian offences that happen within football stadiums, and therefore you have the police who were toothless to deal with those big banners and sectarian shouting and singing, and now they have that act to be able to deal with people within football. But it doesn't take away the fact that organisation as a whole have a permissive environment for sectarianism to happen on those days, and they do nothing to stop that. And then also with this being such a public programme of anti-sectarianism, trying to get in to speak to the Orange Lodge and to anybody within it, the doors are closed and they feel attacked, and we can't have that conversation with them. So I think that's really difficult. So I'll be really interested to see what the next household attitude survey says around sectarianism, on whether the balance has swung in some way to people that identify with loyalism or some kind of unionism to feel attacked themselves, because I certainly know that within my family, which I don't hold the same beliefs, but that is their attitude. They feel attacked by all of the stuff in newspapers, and and when they read it, it's a personal offence to them that they're being.
Maybe part of the problem is that we have that act, which might be very good, but we haven't really contextualised exactly why it is that people have come to the places that they are. Again, it goes back to what we're saying about having some kind of truth and reconciliation committee. I mean, we will just say, look, you can't do this, you can't do this, you can't do this, but there's been no background, no rationalisation, nothing like that. So maybe people are feeling attacked simply because they don't see any justification for why they can't do X, Y, and Z. Maybe we have to have a much more of a justification. I mean, which obviously exists, but maybe we need to make it more public. The reasons.
I think the language of sectarianism has been difficult to engage people because they don't want to be tarred as that. They don't identify themselves as that, and they don't want to have conversations. Certainly our project has really, really struggled to engage women that identify either as religiously Protestant or culturally Protestant. It's just been really, really difficult to engage those people.
I've been really interested in terms of, one of the key things is everyone's talked about education being a big key to generations of people who or people sort of say who we consider well educated, who work, who you see in everyday life, like parents, and I'm going to say they're people that who you wouldn't ever think that they would have a bad over their body, and they come out with phrases, and you sit there and go, oh, right, okay, and then someone else who, for instance, knows what I do for a living, goes around, there's no anti-sectarianism going on here, like, no, definitely no anti-sectarianism at all, and they're saying these ways because they say it all the time, and they don't see the issue with it, and it's getting past that sort of almost unconscious bias, so you don't realise you're saying it, you don't realise it, habit, I think that's the word I'm looking for, habit, that's where I'm interested in seeing how this goes forward, to happen those sort of very ingrained attitudes where you don't see it as a problem, but you're a good person and you don't think these things, so therefore it's okay for you to say it. That's where I've been.
I think that's where there's an argument as well for not treating sectarianism in a silo on its own.
Yeah.
Because I think it's very rare that you'll find someone who displays sectarian attitudes or behaviours but doesn't display others, such as homophobia or racism.
Yeah, that's definitely what came out of our project.
Yeah.
There was a real intersectional aspect to sectarianism, and especially for women living around Ibrox, they were especially saying that they don't go out on those days because they're on big match days, because they're scared that they'll be abused for being Muslim women, abused for wearing the hijab, and then also
Everything else.
and then maybe if they were wearing green saris or whatever, that they would be targeted for that too. So it's the byproducts are as damaging as the core sectarian.
It's like asking somebody, why do you not want to buy that green hat? Because it's green. But why? Because it's green. They honestly don't know why, other than because it's that colour.
Yeah.
It's quite
I think there's like about what you were saying, Rachel, about the justification, when I think about it, I feel that I have to justify when my actions, whatever I did, responded or react to what other person did, instead of coming from a place of what do I need right now. So they were calls for external or answering to external stimulus rather than coming from my needs or my values, and I think that's something that happens quite often, like in general, just like, or when I think about myself, like personally, or friends or wider community, like sometimes it's like we are all the time like responding to each other. There is no time to take that therapy time to appreciate or just like to settle in to look like what
reaction.
So I think for me that's something that I think when I think like where does the need of justification come from, or where does it come from, I think for me is that something about everything is like part of the web, like very linked.
Just tagging on to that, the question of who takes the initiative, and obviously in terms of organisations who are doing that, but sort of person to person, if you feel threatened, even if you, there's also at the back of your mind, well, somebody's got to start challenging this. That's a huge step to take. And it's up to them, if they want to change, they have to do it. I don't. So it's trying to, again, it's kind of empowering people to say that if we really believe something is wrong and is not for the good of individuals in the community, then how can we take the initiative to start challenging it? And obviously the kind of work we're doing helps that. But it doesn't only have to happen kind of formally, if you like, in the structure.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's kind of trying to ripple it out.
I mean, it's easy formally, but it's difficult informally. So,
It's another question I've asked many times, is who's got responsibility?
Yeah.
got power to tackle this, and everybody always wants to put the responsibility on somebody else. And my argument has always been, well, we all have a responsibility to do something, to make a difference, but we should always do that safely. You know, don't put yourself at risk. But there are so many different ways of doing that, whether it's in the example, for instance, of someone that can stop being yelled at because they're wearing a saree, for instance, or they're wearing a blue t-shirt. How do you deal with that? I think everybody in that area has a responsibility to do something about it, but to do that you need to do it safely, whether it is about calling the police or asking somebody else, can you come stand next to me while I address this? And it's about the context and how you deal with that, but we do all have an individual responsibility, I think, to make a change and to take to change it, to help somebody to change an attitude or whatever it is.
This ties into something that we were doing with the groups, which was the bystander effect, and whether people get involved in incidents that happen. It could be any kind of, it could be even just a robbery or not necessarily a sectarian thing, and how that also relates to whether people feel that they can get involved in communities. And that's a problem across the board. It's sectarian issue. It's all kinds of violence.
We were also looking like into the like if something very good happened, as in someone was going to give you, I don't know, you have won a prize or something, like, so not only like when we were doing the work, it wasn't only focusing on something negative has happened or something violent, but like it's also the other way around. How if it was a matter of celebrating or hey, congratulations or something. Yeah. So.
It's just this idea about whether or not people do tend to see themselves first and foremost as being responsible in a situation, and I guess it comes down to things like fear and do you actually know what to do, things that you were saying. But how do we encourage that sense of civic responsibility?
I guess on another side of it as well, in a situation where it's peer pressure, you know, there's, say it's just banter, and you know, you're in a situation where a friend says something that you don't agree with, but you don't feel empowered enough in that situation to challenge it, so you laugh, for example, which I think happens all the time, and with adults as well. Like, how do you give people the confidence themselves to think, no, my opinion here is not yours, and has just as much.
That's really
there's a general attitude in this broadcast by, like, you know, funding or laws or whatever, that you know, it's almost like, you know, society's got your back and you're not going out on a limb. Do you know what I mean? So it's the same now. It'd be much easier, sort of say compared now to 50 years ago. If someone's been homophobic, it's dead easy to challenge them, because you know, and the other people would shout up, as you said something, other people would shout up for you as well. Whereas, you know, 50 years ago, I don't know, I mean, I wasn't alive 50 years ago, but I imagine that would then put you at some, you know, you would end up yourself at risk of people would start, you know. So I think the wider kind of environment and social environment is very helpful. If there's a clear message out and about that sectarianism is unacceptable, then it does help that process. No, I don't. But I mean, but I mean, I think other things, homophobia, racism, would be good examples where that has happened and that message has been applied in a whole lot of different ways, and that message has been quite widely. I mean, even say football matches now, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, racist chanting and racist abuse was common. You know, it was just part of it. It was part of what happened. Now, if you did it now, you'd be told to shut up, and then if you kept doing it, other people would tell you to shut up, and you'd end up getting up and down. You know, it's completely unacceptable.
I think that's true, but again, I think it's in the same vein as telling people not to use certain languages, because racism has by no stretch of the imagination disappeared, and you know, racist incidents are still. And I think
the situation is better.
I think it depends who you ask or who you speak to and what communities you're in, because I think subtle discrimination now is really where we're at in terms of
attacks on Islam has increased about triple-fold since the Paris attacks, for example, so it does change.
And unemployment in the Muslim community is the worst out of any community, and that's something that's not necessarily on the front. This is an awful situation, but it's still there very much.
Yeah, I'm not saying it's going away, but I think though that the things have improved. Say, especially if you go back 30 years or 40 years, I think there's evidence that things have got better and that things can change, and it's part of it's about deep-seated and genuine attitude and change. Other parts of it about just creating an environment of peace and attitudes and acceptance.
I think the problem is, but we tend to view progress as if it's constantly going forwards, but things can go back as well. And I think it's in the case of Islam, for example, given the recent headlines, given things that Trump is saying and all these people that are in the public eye, we can go back as well. And I think it has actually been back. Our understanding of Islam and our horrible word to use, tolerance.
Working on these things, it was never a complete
I think that can happen with homophobia, it can happen with Catholic Protestant, it can always go back.
I'm actually wondering, in terms of naming these issues, how much of what's going on now is being labelled as unfair, when actually it's also racism.
And also sectarian, potentially.
So we are, I think, we're starting to fall into a trap where we're saying racism isn't an issue anymore, and we've got these new, shiny new issues to deal with, when actually they're all intersectional and all interlinked and all put together. And I think we are in danger of running into that trap of racism.
And I think our baseline is important there as well, because it's like, what are we looking to? Okay, historically, are we looking at the slave trade, or are we looking at equality? Because really, yes, things have gotten better in that sense, but we're still by no means equal in certain senses. So,
and I guess because a bit like to start closing up a bit, but I think, as you were saying before, I think all the work being done is about opening up, it's about exploring, and I think from the work and from the learning we got from the project, it's like, for me, sectarianism is not yet in a place to be dealt with. It's like we still have to open up and empower. I think empower people's opinion matters, and it's just a matter of doing it from a place of understanding and from a place of, I think, acceptance and respect, I would say. But I think I just wanted maybe to close the discussion and ask the last question, which I guess it was interesting to know from your personal point of view and professional as well. But how do you think we can get to that place? How could we make genuine change happen? What would in Scotland? What would be needed? And
I think it's about recognising it's a slow process. It is not something that you can sort of put on a shelf and say, that's that, I'm interested. I think it's really important for everyone to recognise that we can't just make a change and that's happening. It's not about an instant thing. It will never be. And it's about recognising that it needs to be continuous work. It needs to be recognising that it's a slow process and it's not going to happen overnight.
and like you said, it's that transparency at all levels. That yes, we recognise this is happening here, here, and here, and we're committed to trying to change that.
It's probably, sorry Caro, I was going to say I think there's probably a lot of different things, but I think the main thing for me is that we take people aged in Glasgow anyway, we take people aged 5 and we split them up, we put these ones into these schools and these ones on the basis of religion, or not religion, and then they're there until 16 at least, which is 11 of the key psychological developmental years of a person. And when you're at school, you tend to become friends with the people who are at your school, the people who are in your class, and so that reinforces your sense of difference from these other people who are at this other school. And then when they get to age 16, which is when male aggression tends to be at its most potent, 16, 17, 18, the teen years, and they start fighting with each other, we wonder why they're so different and why we feel that they're so different. And so to me that's the elephant in the room, and until we address that, then that's about 70 to 80% of the problem that's not being addressed.
I'm putting you on the spot.
I think that in the institutions, I think communities are working really, really amazingly hard on this and have really done amazingly to get involved in this work. But the big institutions now need to start unpicking themselves and looking at the permissive environments for sectarianism that they maintain.
What do you mean by the big institutions?
The Scottish Football Association, the Orange Lodges across Scotland.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think within the advisory group report there was stuff about there needed to be more integration between the Catholic Church and the Church of Scotland, and that their interpretation of what had happened with churches' work during all of this work that didn't go far enough to encourage integration. So there was work done separately, but they didn't see enough integrated stuff in communities, and they wanted to see more of that. So I don't know, I don't have an opinion on that because I don't know anything about it. But yeah, so those are the three big patriarchies in Scotland.
I think, I suppose, a bit related to that, we seem to live in a society which does a number of things quite well and a number of things quite badly, so it's good at creating huge amounts of wealth and generating power, but it also concentrates that in a few hands, and it doesn't distribute either that power or that wealth very well. And we also seem to live in a society which produces a whole load of antagonisms and difficulties along a whole number of different. It looks always to divide people up and create conflict between people and destroy the environment and so on. So it does all these things quite badly. And I think that a lot of these things we've spoken about today are really, they seem to be symptomatic and pretty much ubiquitous in all economies and all societies that felt like ours. They seem to be very not similar, but they seem to exist. Well, we've got the Donald Trump thing, we've got the thing in France. We seem to have these sort of tensions that are developed in sort of societies and economies that we have. I think we really need to have a look at why that is the case and how these things have been reproduced and for what reasons. And I expect inequality is a huge amount to play in that. We do have these issues in other countries as well, which are really equal. But I think that, especially when it comes to the design of the economy, if you like, that there needs to be a look at how that has been done and what's that relationship is to these things.
Anything else you would want to add?
Can we get a cup of tea?
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for the discussion. Thank you.
Cheers.